The flight plan came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, which was unusual for Holford Municipal, but not unprecedented. We got the occasional late filing from charter outfits running organ transports, or from private pilots who thought instrument currency meant they could fly whenever they felt like it. I was halfway through my shift, drinking bad coffee from the machine in the break room that Dale Wiegand claimed had been there since the first Bush administration, and the system chimed the way it always did, a short, unremarkable tone indicating a new IFR plan in the queue. I walked back to the operations desk and opened it. The flight plan was filed for a Beechcraft Baron, tail number N4417F, departing Springfield Capital, arriving Holford Municipal. Route, direct. Requested altitude, 6,000. Estimated time en route, 42 minutes. Pilot in command, R. Vickers. Souls on board, 3. It was a clean filing. Proper formatting, proper codes, all required fields populated. The system had accepted it without flags, which meant the tail number had passed the FAA registry validation check. I noted the estimated arrival time, 12:29 a.m., and began the standard pre-arrival checklist. Runway lights confirmed active. AWAS broadcasting current weather. No conflicting traffic in the pattern. Then I ran the tail number through the registry lookup, because I run every tail number through the registry lookup. It's not required for a filed flight plan that's already been validated, but I'd been doing it since my Air Force days, and habits formed in military ATC don't soften easily. N4417F returned no active registration. I checked again. The FAA registry showed the number as canceled. Aircraft destroyed, October 14, 1978. Beechcraft Baron 58. Serial number TH318. Last registered owner, Vickers Aviation Services, Springfield, Illinois. Status, destroyed in accident. NTSB report number CHI79FA003. I looked at the flight plan on my screen, then at the registry result, then back at the flight plan. The system had accepted a filing from an aircraft that had been destroyed 47 years ago. I deleted the flight plan, logged it as a data entry error in the operations journal, and went back to my coffee. That should have been the end of it. At any other facility, at any point in my career before that night, it would have been. Phantom entries happen. Transposed digits, recycled tail numbers, software hiccups during overnight batch processing. I'd seen a flight plan come through once at Scott Air Force Base for a C-130 that was sitting in a boneyard in Arizona. The systems are good, but they're not infallible. I finished my shift at 6 a.m., drove home to my apartment on the north side of Bloomington, and slept until 2 in the afternoon. My daughter called at 4, her Wednesday call, the one the custody agreement specified. We talked about her science project, which involved growing crystals from borax solution. She wanted to know if I could come to the school presentation on Friday. I told her I'd try, knowing I probably couldn't. Friday was an overnight shift, and I'd need to sleep during the day. After we hung up, I sat on my couch and looked at the wall for a while. The apartment was a rental, clean, functional, temporary in the way that everything in my life felt temporary since the divorce. I'd moved to Bloomington for the Holford job because it was the only operations supervisor position I could find within driving distance of Champaign, where my daughter lived. The job was solitary, underpaid, and carried responsibilities that a properly staffed facility would have distributed among 3 people. But it kept me in the same part of Illinois as my kid, and that was enough. I went back to work Tuesday night and the flight plan was in the system again. Same tail number, same aircraft, same pilot, same route, altitude, souls on board. Filed at 11:47 p.m., the same minute, down to the second, as the previous filing. Estimated arrival, 12:29 a.m. I sat at the operations desk and looked at it for a long time. Then I opened the system's filing metadata, the background information that records where a flight plan originates. Normally this shows the filing source, DUATS, ForeFlight, a flight service station, a direct submission through the FAA's ICAO interface. The source field was blank, not unknown, not error, blank. The flight plan had entered the system without an identifiable origin. It existed in the queue as if it had always been there. I didn't delete it this time. I printed a hard copy, and put it in the shift folder. Then I opened the NTSB accident database and searched for report number SHI79FA003. The report was 17 pages. I read it at the operations desk between radio checks, the printer still warm from the hard copy. On October 14, 1978, at approximately 12:31 a.m., a Beechcraft Baron 58, registered as N4417F, impacted terrain in a soybean field approximately 4 miles southeast of Holford Municipal Airport during an instrument approach to runway 18. The pilot, Raymond Allen Vickers, age 44, and 2 passengers were killed. The aircraft was destroyed by impact forces and post-crash fire. The probable cause was listed as the pilot's failure to maintain adequate spatial orientation during a non-precision instrument approach in instrument meteorological conditions, which resulted in controlled flight into terrain. Contributing factors included low ceiling, reduced visibility due to fog, and the pilot's possible fatigue. Vickers had been an experienced instrument pilot, 3,200 hours total time, 840 in type. He held a commercial certificate with instrument and multi-engine ratings. He'd flown the Springfield to Holford route regularly, often at night, often in marginal weather. The NTSB characterized the flight as routine and the approach as standard. I read through the factual sections, the analysis, and the probable cause determination. It was thorough but unremarkable, the kind of accident report that fills volumes in the NTSB archive. Experienced pilot, bad weather, controlled flight into terrain. It happens. It still happens. One detail caught my attention. On page 14, there was an addendum dated April 1979, 6 months after the original report, noting that the aircraft's cargo manifest had been reclassified as unavailable pursuant to administrative review. No further explanation. The original manifest, which should have been included as an appendix, was absent from the file. Every other appendix, weather data, pilot records, wreckage diagram, witness statements, was present. A missing cargo manifest isn't suspicious by itself. Records from 1978 were paper. Paper gets misfiled, damaged, lost in storage. The addendum could mean anything. But it was the only part of the report that had been changed after the initial finding, and it had been changed to remove information rather than add it. I closed the report and looked at the flight plan still sitting in the system queue. N4417F, R. Vickers, 3 souls, Springfield to Holford. The same flight, filed 47 years after the aircraft burned in a bean field. I mentioned it to Dale Wiegand the next morning during the shift overlap. Dale came in at 5:30 a.m. to open the maintenance office, and we usually shared 20 minutes of overlap before I left. He was a slow-moving, deliberate man with reading glasses permanently perched on his forehead and oil stains on his khakis that he'd stopped trying to remove years ago. He'd worked at Holford since 1989, but he'd grown up in the area and had spent summers at the airport as a teenager, mowing grass and cleaning hangars. N4417F, I said. Beechcraft Baron. Ring a bell? Dale was pouring coffee from his thermos. He didn't trust the break room machine either, and his hand paused mid-pour. Not a flinch, not a dramatic reaction. Just a pause. The kind a person makes when a word reaches a room in their memory they haven't opened in a long time. Vickers, he said. You remember it? I was here. Summer of '78. I was working grounds crew. 16 years old. He finished pouring his coffee and capped the thermos with careful precision. He flew in and out of here a couple times a week. Cargo runs, mostly. I used to watch him land from the mow tractor. He'd come in over the south field low enough that you could read the tail number. You were here the night he crashed? No, that was October. I'd gone back to school by then. He took a sip of coffee. But I heard about it the next day. My dad knew the airport manager at the time, Frank Hester. Frank was the one who took the call when the farmer reported the fire in his field. What was Vickers carrying? Dale looked at me over his coffee. Why are you asking about a crash from 1978? I told him about the flight plans. Both of them. The identical filings, the blank source field, the canceled tail number that the system had accepted anyway. Dale listened the way Dale listened to everything, without visible alarm, processing at his own speed. Probably a software thing, he said when I finished. They updated the filing system last year. Could be pulling phantom data from an old archive. The system doesn't store flight plans from 1978. It was built in 2011. Then I don't know what to tell you. He paused. But Leigh, N4417F has been gone a long time. Whatever's putting it in your system, it's not Ray Vickers. He said it gently. The way you say something when you're not entirely sure it's true. The transponder return appeared on Thursday night. Tom Eshelman was in the tower. He worked 3 overnight shifts a week, splitting the schedule with me since the tower technically required a licensed operator present whenever the field was active. Tom was a quiet, careful man with 28 years of ATC experience, most of it at Peoria, who'd taken the part-time Halford position as a pre-retirement wind-down. He didn't rattle. I was downstairs at the operations desk when he called on the intercom. Leigh, I've got a primary and secondary target on approach from the south. Squawking 4721. No flight following with Springfield. No contact on any frequency. He just appeared. Squawk code 4721. I checked the flight plan in the system, the one I'd stopped deleting because deleting it hadn't accomplished anything. N4417F's assigned transponder code was 4721. I went up to the tower. Tom was at the radar scope, a compact display that covered Holford's airspace and about 40 miles in each direction. The target was clearly defined, a bright, steady return at 6,000 feet, 12 miles south, tracking north. Ground speed, 168 knots. Consistent with a Beechcraft Baron in cruise flight. I've been calling on approach frequency, Tom said. No response. Tried Guard 2, nothing. Guard, 121.5 MHz, the universal emergency frequency. If a pilot can't reach anyone on a normal frequency, Guard is the fallback. Everyone monitors Guard. I looked at the radar return. It was clean, not the smeared, intermittent blip you get from weather clutter or a false return. It had the sharp, defined signature of a real aircraft with a functioning transponder. Could be a Nordo, Tom said. Nordo, no radio. An aircraft with a communications failure. It happens. Standard procedure is to clear the runway, flash the light gun, and let them land. Check the Mode C, I said. Tom expanded the data block. Mode C. Altitude encoding from the transponder. The target was descending. 6,000 feet. 5,800, 5,600. Rate of descent approximately 500 feet per minute, consistent with the beginning of an instrument approach. He's coming in, Tom said. I looked out the tower windows. The sky was clear. Visibility was better than 10 miles. A nearly full moon lit the flat prairie in pale gray. If an aircraft was 12 miles south at 6,000 feet and descending toward us, we'd see its navigation lights. The red and green wingtip lights, the white tail light, the rotating beacon. At this distance, the beacon would be visible as a flashing point of light against the dark sky. There was nothing. Clear sky from horizon to horizon. Tom, do you see anything at the 180 radial? He put down binoculars I hadn't noticed him pick up. No. We watched the radar. The target continued its descent. 5,000 feet, 4,200. 3,800. It was following the published ILS approach for runway 18, the same approach that had existed, in various forms, since the 1970s. The same approach Raymond Vickers had been flying the night he died. 3,000 feet, 2,400. Tom was leaning forward now, his hands flat on the console. The target was 6 miles south, less than 5 minutes from the threshold if it maintained its approach speed. I'm turning up the runway lights, I said. For what? For whatever that is. Leigh, there's nothing out there. It's a false target. False targets don't squawk assigned codes from active flight plans. Tom looked at me. In the green light of the radar scope, his face had the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already solved. The target descended through 1,000 feet, 800, 600. It was on the glide path. On the localizer, 1.5 miles from the threshold. I stepped to the window and looked south. The runway lights stretched out below us, 2 parallel lines of white converging in the distance. Beyond them, the dark flat nothing of central Illinois in January. No lights. No aircraft. No sound. 400 feet. 300. 200. Decision height for the ILS approach to runway 18. The altitude at which a pilot either sees the runway and lands, or doesn't and goes around. The target stopped descending at 200 feet. It held altitude for approximately 8 seconds. I counted them without meaning to, the way I'd been trained to count during timing exercises at Scott. Then the return vanished. Cleanly. Not a fade. Not a gradual loss. It was there, and then the scope was empty. The digital log recorded the event. Target N4417F, approach to runway 18, terminated at 200 feet AGL at 12:31 a.m. 12:31 a.m., the same time, to the minute, that the aircraft had impacted terrain in 1978. Tom sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. 28 years, he said. I've never seen anything like that. I need to file a report. What kind of report? An unknown aircraft in the pattern, no radio contact, no visual acquisition. If I don't report it and the FAA pulls our logs for any reason, we're both in violation. Tom nodded slowly. He understood the procedural reality. We were required by regulation to report any unexplained aircraft activity. Failure to report was a certificate action, the kind of thing that ended careers. File it, he said. But Leigh, I'd keep the language technical. Anomalous radar return. Equipment under review. Don't mention the tail number if you can avoid it. The tail number is in the transponder log. They'll see it. Tom didn't answer. He just looked at the empty scope. I filed the report Friday morning. Mandatory occurrence report to the FAA Great Lakes Regional Office in Des Plaines. I kept the language as clinical as I could. Anomalous transponder return, unverified target, no visual acquisition, no radio contact. I included the transponder code and tail number because the digital log already contained them and omitting them would have been falsification. I also included the flight plan, both filings, the blank source field, the canceled registration. The FAA called me that afternoon. Not a regional desk agent, a safety inspector named Cassandra Oyalaran, who introduced herself with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. Ms. Calloway, I've reviewed your occurrence report. I'm going to need to come out to your facility. When? Monday. I'll need access to your radar logs, communication recordings, flight plan archives, and the tower equipment. I'll also need to interview your tower operator. Understood. I want to be transparent with you. An anomalous transponder return is one thing. A transponder return using a code assigned to a flight plan filed under a tail number that's been canceled for 47 years. That's signal interference. That's a federal matter. I'm aware. Is there anything you'd like to add to the report before I arrive? No. Okay. Monday morning, 8 o'clock. I hung up and sat at my desk and thought about what I had just done. I had filed a federal report documenting impossible events at my facility. An FAA investigation would generate records. Records that my ex-husband's attorney could subpoena. Records that would describe the operations supervisor at Holford Municipal reporting ghost aircraft in her airspace. I could hear the argument already. Your Honor, Miss Calloway is either experiencing delusions during her shifts or she's filing false federal reports. Either way, this is not a stable custodial environment. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. She listened, asked 2 questions, and told me I'd done the right thing procedurally, but to document everything and avoid speculation in any further filings. If someone asks you what you think is causing it, she said, the answer is always, I don't know, and I've reported it to the appropriate authority. That's it. Don't theorize. Monday morning, Cass Oyalaran arrived in a rental car and a dark blue blazer and began taking Holford Municipal apart with the methodical patience of someone who does this for a living. She pulled every log. She inspected every piece of tower equipment. She ran diagnostic software on the radar system, the transponder decoder, the flight plan processing server. She checked the AWAs, the radio receivers, the recording equipment. She interviewed Tom, who told her exactly what he'd seen. A clean target, on approach, on the published glide path, that vanished at decision height. He used technical language and kept his opinions to himself. She interviewed me. I gave her the same account, plus the history of the flight plan filings. She wrote everything down in a leather-bound notebook and didn't editorialize. On Tuesday, she checked for unauthorized transmitting equipment within a 20-mile radius. She contacted Springfield Approach to verify no untracked traffic had transited the area. She reviewed ADS-B data from satellite receivers. She consulted with an avionics specialist in Chicago about the possibility of transponder code spoofing. On Wednesday afternoon, she sat down across from me in the break room and set her notebook on the table. "I can't find a source," she said. "What does that mean for the investigation?" "It means the investigation continues, but I want to be honest with you. In 14 years with the FAA, I've investigated signal interference, GPS spoofing, and one case where a disgruntled employee was broadcasting false radar returns with a modified weather station. In every case, there was a physical source, a transmitter, a device, a piece of hardware somewhere that was generating the signal. And here, the signals appear to originate inside your system, not from an external source. The flight plans weren't filed through any known interface. The transponder return was generated internally by the radar processor, not received from an external transponder, as if the system itself is producing the data. A software malfunction. Maybe, but software malfunctions don't generate accurate flight characteristics. The approach speed, descent rate, and glide path in your radar log are consistent with a Beechcraft Baron 58, flying a standard ILS approach. The software would have to simulate an aircraft type it has no reason to model. We looked at each other across the break room table. The coffee machine gurgled in the corner. "You know about the 1978 crash," I said. I pulled the NTSB report. "Yes. The cargo manifest is missing." Cass opened her notebook and turned to a page near the back. I noticed that. The addendum reclassifying it was signed by an NTSB field office supervisor named Bernard Kurtz. Kurtz retired in 1982 and died in 1996. I can't find any record of why the manifest was pulled. Doesn't that seem... It seems like a 47-year-old filing discrepancy in a paper archive. It could mean a dozen things, most of them bureaucratic. She closed the notebook. "Ms. Calloway, I'm going to be here through the end of the week. If the anomaly recurs, I want to observe it directly. And if it does, then I'll have to expand the investigation. And that means more people, more time, and a lot more visibility. More visibility, more records, more ammunition for a custody
The
hearing."
hydraulics are failing
"Understood,"
again.
I said.
I know.
Dale
The seals
found
are
me
shot.
Thursday morning in the maintenance
Can we get it
hangar.
running by morning?
I was doing a
I'll
routine
need
inspection
parts
of
from
the
the
snow
yard.
removal
Okay,
equipment.
let's go
One
check.
of the many non-operations tasks that fell to me because there was no one else. And he walked in with his thermos and his unhurried gait and stood next to the plow blade and said, "I need to tell you something about Ray Vickers." I set down my clipboard. In the summer of '78, Vickers was flying 2 or 3 trips a week out of Springfield. He'd land here, a truck would pull up to the apron, they'd offload cargo, and the truck would leave. Frank Hester, the airport manager, handled it. Nobody else was supposed to be near the aircraft during offload. What was the cargo? I don't know. I was 16. I mowed grass. But I was curious, the way 16-year-olds are, and one evening in August, I was in the hangar when the truck arrived. I saw them unload 2 aluminum cases from the Baron. Heavy. It took 2 men to move each one. The cases had no markings, no shipping labels, no hazmat placards, nothing. "And you never asked?" I asked Frank the next day. He told me it was agricultural supplies and to mind my own business. Frank was a decent man, but he had a way of closing a door that made you understand it was staying closed. "Why are you telling me now?" Dale looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not fear. Something older, because when that plane went down, I was the one who rode out to the field with my dad to look at it. Before the NTSB, before the sheriff. My dad was volunteer fire. We were there first. He paused and took a drink from his thermos, and I had the sense that he was organizing something he'd been carrying for a very long time. The airplane was burned, impact and fire. There wasn't much left. But the cargo area was in the aft fuselage section, and that section had separated on impact, and was about 60 yards from the main wreckage. It was burned too, but not as badly. The cargo doors were open. The cases weren't there. They could have been thrown clear. I walked that field with my dad for an hour before anyone else arrived. Bean stubble and dirt, flat as a table. If 2 aluminum cases had been ejected on impact, they'd have been visible. They weren't there. Maybe they were recovered later. NTSB. The NTSB wreckage inventory is in the report. I've read it. No cases. No aluminum containers of any kind. We stood in the hangar. The space heater in the corner ticked. Outside, the wind moved across the runway and pushed at the hangar door. Dale, are you telling me someone removed cargo from the crash site before the investigation team arrived? I'm telling you what I saw and what I didn't see. Draw your own conclusions. He capped his thermos. There's one more thing. The crash site. The farmer who owned that field was Ed McAllister. Ed's son Brian farms it now. Last fall, Brian deep-tilled the south quarter, went down about 18 inches, deeper than normal, to break up a compaction layer. He hit something metallic, thought it was an old fence post. I was out there in November helping him look at a drainage issue, and he mentioned it. Said it was too heavy to pull out with the tractor, so he just plowed around it. Where exactly? Dale gave me coordinates. Not GPS, but the farmer's version. South quarter, 200 yards west of the tree line, about 60 yards south of where the county put up a memorial marker for the crash victims in 1980. 60 yards south. The same distance Dale estimated between the main wreckage and the separated cargo section. I drove out to the crash site that afternoon. The field was winter bare, harvested stubble and frozen soil, flat and featureless under a gray sky. The memorial marker was a small granite stone set back from the county road, engraved with 3 names: Raymond A. Vickers, pilot; Margaret Hollis, passenger; David Kren, passenger. Someone had placed a small American flag next to it, faded and wind-whipped. I walked south from the marker, counting paces. The soil was hard but not frozen solid. The January had been mild, and the ground had a thin crust that broke under my boots. At approximately 60 yards, I began scanning. I found it at 72 yards south. The tilling had brought the top edge above the surface, maybe 3 inches of corroded metal protruding from the dirt. It was flat, rectangular, and too regularly shaped to be geological. I knelt and brushed soil away from the edge. The metal was aluminum, heavily oxidized but structurally intact. It was the corner of a container. I didn't dig further. I took photographs with my phone, the exposed edge, its position relative to the memorial marker, the surrounding field. I measured the visible dimensions with a tape measure from my car. The exposed portion was approximately 14 inches long and 2 inches wide. The rest was buried. I drove back to Holford and sat in my office and looked at the photographs on my phone. Then I looked at the NTSB report on my screen. Then I looked at the flight plan that was still sitting in my system queue, filed by a dead pilot for an aircraft that no longer existed. The events arranged themselves into a sequence that I couldn't ignore. An aircraft carrying unmarked aluminum cases crashes in 1978. The cases disappear from the crash site before the investigation. The cargo manifest is removed from the NTSB report 6 months later. 47 years pass. Then the aircraft begins appearing in the system, filing flight plans, squawking transponder codes, flying the same approach, and in the same season, the Earth turns up what appears to be one of the cases. I was not a detective. I was not an NTSB investigator. I was an airport operations supervisor with a custody battle and an FAA inspector in my facility. But I was also the person sitting at the desk when the dead man's flight plan came through, and that made it mine whether I wanted it or not. I called Cass Oylerin. I found something at the 1978 crash site, I said. I think you need to see it. There was a pause. Ms. Calloway, my investigation covers signal interference at your facility. A 47-year-old crash site is outside my scope. The signals are connected to the crash. The tail number, the flight path, the approach, it's all the same flight. And there's physical evidence at the crash site that wasn't in the NTSB report. Another pause, longer. What kind of physical evidence? A buried metal container consistent with the cargo Dale Wiegand described seeing on the aircraft before the crash. cargo, that wasn't in the wreckage inventory, and that disappeared from the official record when the manifest was pulled. I heard her exhale. I'll come look at it, but Leigh, this isn't my investigation to open. If there's an issue with the NTSB report, that's a cold case review. I'd have to refer it up. I understand. And if I refer it up, this gets bigger. A lot bigger than anomalous radar returns at a municipal airport. I know. We drove out to the field together Friday morning. Cass looked at the exposed metal, took her own photographs, and knelt in the dirt for a long time without speaking. When she stood up, her expression had changed. The professional skepticism was still there, but it had been joined by something else. The look of a person who has found a door in a wall where no door should be.
I'll make some calls, she said.
Friday night, I was alone in the tower. Tom had called in. His wife was in the emergency room in Peoria with a kidney stone, nothing life-threatening but requiring his presence. I covered both positions, which I wasn't supposed to do but which happened regularly at a facility with our staffing level. At 11:47 p.m., the flight plan appeared again. N4417F, R. Vickers, 3 souls, Springfield to Holford. At 12:14 a.m., the transponder return appeared on the scope. 6,000 feet, 12 miles south, tracking north. Squawking, 4721. I watched it descend. 6,000, 5,000, 4,000. Following the glide path with the mechanical precision of an aircraft on a coupled approach. At 3,000 feet, the radio came alive. Holford Radio, November 4417 Foxtrot, ILS runway 18, 3000, requesting clearance. The voice was calm, professional. Male, middle-aged, with the flat Illinois accent of someone who'd grown up between Springfield and Bloomington. He used the facility identifier Holford Radio, a designation that had been retired in 1983 when the tower was upgraded. Nobody alive would use that identifier unless they'd learned it before it changed. I keyed the microphone. My hand was steady. My voice was steady. 14 years of air traffic control. You learn to keep the frequency clean regardless of what's happening in your head. November 4417 Foxtrot Holford Tower, say your position and intentions. Holford, 4417 Foxtrot is on the ILS 18, passing through 2,800. Full stop. I need to get this on the ground. I need to get this on the ground. The radar showed his descent continuing. 2,400, 2,000, 1,600. He was on the glide path, on the localizer, tracking straight for runway 18. I looked out the tower windows. Moonlight on the prairie. Empty sky. 4417 Foxtrot. Negative radar contact with traffic at your position. Say aircraft type and confirm tail number. Beechcraft Baron 58, November 4417 Foxtrot. Holford, I need to complete this approach. I've been trying to get in for a long time. 1,200 feet. 1,800. 4417 Foxtrot, I have you on radar but no visual. Confirm you have the field in sight. Negative field in sight. Continuing approach. I'll break out at minimums. 600 feet. 400. He was a mile from the threshold. Decision height in seconds. Every previous night, the return had vanished at 200 feet. The same altitude, the same point, the same moment where Raymond Vickers had failed to see the runway and flown into the ground in 1978. Every night, the flight ended where it had always ended. 200 feet. The return held. For the first time, the radar track did not disappear. N4417F passed through 200 feet and continued descending. 180, 160, 140. And then the voice came through again, but different. Not the standard phraseology. Not the professional cadence of an instrument pilot on approach. A man's voice, steady, but carrying the weight of something that had been waiting almost half a century to be said. Holford, 4417 Foxtrot. I need you to record this, please. I was already recording. The tower communication system recorded everything automatically, but I reached over and activated the backup recorder, the handheld unit I kept in the desk drawer for equipment redundancy, and said, 4417 Foxtrot, you are being recorded. Go ahead. He spoke for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. I timed it on the tower clock because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. He said that on October 14, 1978, he was carrying 2 aluminum cases from Springfield to Holford. He said the cases contained financial documents and bearer bonds connected to a real estate investment scheme operated by 3 members of the Sangamon County government. He said he had been hired to transport the documents to a secure location outside the county before a federal audit that was scheduled for the following week. He said he hadn't known the contents when he agreed to the flight. He said he'd been told it was agricultural records. He said he'd been told the weather was marginal but flyable. He said the weather briefing he received was not the weather briefing that was filed with the NTSB. He said the actual conditions were below minimums, below the legal limits for the approach. He said someone had wanted the flight to go anyway. He said he'd broken out of the overcast at 200 feet and seen the runway. He said he was on glide path, on localizer, configured for landing. He said the aircraft was flying normally. He said the engine failure was not mechanical. He said both engines quit simultaneously at decision height. He said the fuel selectors were functioning. He said someone had introduced a contaminant into the fuel supply at Springfield before departure. He said Margaret Hollis was 31 years old and had a 4-year-old son. He said David Kren was 28 and had just gotten engaged. He said their names were in the NTSB report, but their families never knew why they died. He said the cases were removed from the wreckage by the people who had arranged the flight. He said one case was recovered. He said the other was buried by the impact and they couldn't find it in the dark. He said they left it. Then his voice resumed its professional tone, clean and controlled, and he said, Holford Tower, November 4417 Foxtrot, runway in sight, requesting clearance to land runway 18. The radar return was at 80 feet, on the glide path, on the localizer, lined up with the center line of runway 18. I had no protocol for this. There was no regulation, no manual, no training scenario that covered what I was being asked to do. I was being asked to clear a dead man to land an aircraft that had burned in a field 47 years ago. But I was a controller, and he was a pilot on approach requesting clearance, and the radar said he was there. November 4417 Foxtrot, Holford Tower, cleared to land runway 18, wind calm, altimeter 29902. Cleared to land 18, 4417 Foxtrot. Thank you. The radar return descended through 50 feet, 30, 20. The return crossed the threshold and decelerated along the runway. Ground speed dropping. 100, 80, 60, 40, 20. The target turned off the runway onto taxiway Alpha and stopped. I looked out the window. The runway was empty. The taxiway was empty. Moonlight on concrete. Nothing. The radar showed N4417F, stationary, on taxiway Alpha, for 47 seconds. Then the return disappeared. The transponder code dropped from the system. The flight plan status changed to completed. The radio was silent. I sat in the tower chair and listened to the hum of the equipment and the wind against the glass, and I did not move for a long time. I called Cass Oyleran at 6 a.m. and played her the recording over the phone. She didn't interrupt. When it finished, she was quiet for approximately 10 seconds, which was the longest silence I'd heard from her. I'll be at Holford by noon, she said. Don't let anyone else hear that recording. She arrived at 11:40 a.m. We listened to the recording together in the break room with the door closed. Then we listened to it again. Then she sat back in her chair and pressed her palms against her eyes. If what he said is true, if it's true, the 1978 crash was a homicide. 3 people were murdered to prevent those documents from surfacing before a federal audit. And the buried container is the evidence. Yes, Cass looked at me. You know I have to report this. Not as signal interference, as potential evidence of a crime. I know. And you know what that means for you. An FAA investigation is one thing. A criminal cold case involving 47-year-old evidence discovered by the operations supervisor who's also reporting phantom radar returns. That's going to generate attention. I thought about my daughter's science project, crystals growing from borax solution, the slow, patient accumulation of structure from a supersaturated liquid. I thought about how evidence worked the same way, details accumulating, until a shape became undeniable. "Report it," I said. The excavation happened the following Wednesday, not by me, by a team from the Illinois State Police Evidence Recovery Unit, with Cass supervising as the FAA liaison and a retired NTSB investigator named Paulson observing from the county road because cold case protocol required it. They dug for 4 hours. The container was buried approximately 16 inches below the current surface, consistent with 47 years of agricultural activity gradually covering a heavy object. It was an aluminum transport case, military spec, with a combination lock that had corroded but remained closed. The case was intact. The seal had held. Inside were documents, financial records, correspondence, and 23 bearer bonds with a combined face value in $1978 of $1.4 million. The documents named 3 individuals, 2 Sangamon County commissioners and a Springfield attorney, who had been under federal investigation in the fall of 1978 for a real estate fraud scheme involving inflated land valuations and diverted county funds. The federal audit had taken place on schedule in October 1978. Without the documents, it had found insufficient evidence. The case was closed. The 3 individuals were never charged. All 3 were dead by 2009. The NTSB report for N4417F was referred for cold case review. Paulson, the retired investigator, told Cass that based on the pilot's testimony, she avoided the word testimony and said, the recorded communication, the fuel contamination claim was consistent with a known method of sabotage that had been documented in 3 other small aircraft incidents in the 1970s. He said the original investigation had not tested for contaminants because the post-crash fire had destroyed the fuel system, and because there was no reason to suspect sabotage in what appeared to be a routine weather-related accident. Would it have been detectable? Cass asked. In 1978? Probably not, given the fire damage. But the point is, no one looked. No one had a reason to look. He paused and adjusted his glasses. An older man, mid-70s, with the measured cadence of someone who'd spent a career weighing evidence. Someone took the cargo manifest out of the report to make sure no one ever asked what Vickers was carrying. If that manifest had stayed in the file, someone eventually would have asked why unmarked cargo on a night flight wasn't inventoried at the crash site. That's the kind of discrepancy that generates follow-up. Removing the manifest closed the loop, unquote. The families of Margaret Hollis and David Kren were contacted by the state police in March. I was not involved in those conversations, and I did not ask about them. Some things belonged to the people they happened to. The FAA closed its signal interference investigation in April. The final report classified the events at Holford Municipal as anomalous electronic phenomena, source undetermined, non-recurring. Cass told me the language was the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug, accurate, defensible, and carefully designed to avoid implying anything the agency couldn't explain. Non-recurring, I said. Have the signals come back? They hadn't. Since the night I cleared N44117F to land, the system had been quiet. No phantom flight plans, no transponder returns, no voice on the radio. The flight plan queue showed only real traffic. The flight school Cessnas, the weekend warriors in their Bonanzas, the occasional medevac. Then it's non-recurring, Cass said. She paused. For what it's worth, I'm glad you filed the report, even with everything it cost you. It had cost me. My ex-husband's attorney had obtained the FAA report through a public records request and entered it into evidence at the custody modification hearing in May. The judge read it carefully, asked me 3 questions about my work environment, and ruled that my custody schedule would remain unchanged. But he added a provision requiring a psychological evaluation within 90 days, which I completed in July. The psychologist found me competent, stable, and displaying no signs of delusional thinking. She wrote in her summary that I had responded to anomalous workplace events with appropriate procedural diligence. I kept that sentence. I framed it in my head, if not on my wall. Tom Eshelman retired in June. At his small going-away dinner at the Italian place in Bloomington, he pulled me aside and said, "I've been thinking about that night, the approach." And? He was on glide path the whole time. Dead center. That's not easy in a Baron, even in good weather. Whoever was flying that approach, whatever was flying it, was a hell of a pilot. I smiled. It was the first time I'd smiled about any of it. Dale Wiegand continued working at Holford. I saw him occasionally when I stopped by the facility for administrative reasons. He never brought up N4417F directly, but in November, he stopped me in the parking lot and handed me a manila envelope. "Found these cleaning out the old storage room in the maintenance hangar," he said. "Thought you should have them." Inside were logbook pages, handwritten tower logs from the 1970s and 1980s, the paper records that had preceded the digital system. They were fragile, slightly yellowed, written in various hands. Dale had marked 6 entries with small adhesive flags. I read them at my kitchen table that evening. November 2nd, 1979. Tower operator, F. Hester. 0031Z. Anomalous target on approach, RY-18. Squawk 4721. No visual, no radio. Target faded at minimums. Noted for maintenance review. March 15th, 1981. Tower operator R. Delano. 0031Z. Radar return, ILS-18. N4417F transponder code. No aircraft on frequency. Target lost at DH. Third occurrence this year. January 8, 1984. Tower operator F. Hester. 0031Z. He's back. Same approach. Same altitude. Same point. I don't write these up anymore. Nobody reads them. September 22, 1987. Tower operator G. Palmieri. 0031Z. Unidentified target. ILS-18. Mode C indicates 200 feet at point of disappearance. Consistent with previous entries in this log. No report filed per station manager direction. April 3, 1991. Tower operator R. Delano. 0031Z. N4417F on scope again. 6 years now I've been watching him try. He never makes it past 200 feet. December 12, 2003. Tower operator M. Fisk. 0031Z. Same ghost, same approach, same result. I've read the old entries in this book. He's been at it for 25 years. I don't know what he needs, but he's not getting it. 25 years as of that entry. 47 as of the night I sat in the tower and heard his voice. The same flight, the same approach, the same termination at the altitude where he'd died. Over and over, year after year. Every controller who worked the overnight shift had seen it. Every one of them had written it down. None of them had known what he was trying to say. He needed to land. He needed to deliver what he was carrying. He needed someone to let him finish. I sat at my kitchen table and read the log entries a second time, and a third, and then I closed the envelope and put it in the lockbox. 1 year later, the NTSB Cold Case Review reclassified the probable cause of the crash of N4417F. The new finding read, loss of engine power due to fuel system contamination of undetermined origin, resulting in controlled flight into terrain during instrument approach. Contributing factors: intentional removal of cargo documentation from the original investigation file, preventing identification of motive or third-party involvement. The word intentional had never appeared in the original report. Margaret Hollis's son, now 51, requested a copy of the revised finding. I know this because Cass told me months later over the phone. She said he'd read it in his kitchen, alone, and then called the state police investigator and asked a single question: who finally found the truth. The investigator, following protocol, told him the evidence had been recovered during a routine excavation prompted by an FAA investigation at Holford Municipal Airport. He didn't get the whole story. Nobody did. The recorded transmission was classified as an unverified communication of unknown origin and was not included in the public case file. The voice of Raymond Vickers, explaining how and why he died, existed only on 2 recordings, the tower system backup and my handheld unit. The tower backup was archived with the FAA. My recording was in the lockbox under my bed, next to the logbook pages, next to everything else I'd kept. Some nights, when my daughter was sleeping in the next room, the custody schedule had stabilized, the evaluation was behind me. I'd lie awake and think about Ray Vickers in his Baron, on approach to runway 18, descending through the overcast with 2 aluminum cases in the back, and no idea that his fuel was poisoned. I thought about him breaking out at 200 feet, seeing the runway, reaching for the throttles, and finding nothing there. I thought about the last 4 seconds before impact, and I thought about him trying again. Every year, every month, whatever the interval was, lining up on the localizer and flying the approach and hitting 200 feet and vanishing. Decades of it, a dead pilot flying the same approach into the same runway, unable to descend below the altitude where he'd lost everything, until someone sat in the tower and gave him what he needed. Not an explanation, not a supernatural encounter, just a clearance. Cleared to land runway 18. The simplest, most routine phrase in aviation. The one thing nobody had ever said to him, because nobody had known he was asking.